Is Steven, and we're going to be going over my benchmark final practical, looking at a couple of exercises and doing some motion analysis and some breakdown. So the exercises that I am going over today are the goblet squat as well as the single leg deadlift. Quick overview, the goblet squat is a squat motion that goes through three phases: the ascent phase, the transition phase, and the ascent phase. We see eccentric contraction in the descent phase as well as concentric in the ascent phase. And then for the single leg deadlift, we have the lowering phase, the stabilization phase, which we can see in the picture there, staying in that isometric position, and then the rising phase, where the body comes back up at a neutral position. So here we can go ahead and look at my goblet squat. We're going to go through some information on the goblet squat first. So I'll let the video play out. You can see decent form. We see that hinge motion at the hips, that hip flexion, knee flexion, as well as ankle plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. And can see the distinguished phases as well as the transition right there in the middle as I stay at that a little more than horizontal position with my hips dipping a little bit below my knees. So yeah, we're going to go through a little. I'll let this play out a little bit more as I talk about the kinetics. So as far as kinetics goes, we're looking at the forces produced. So it's important to look at the different joints. So main joints here, motion, can see all of them working here. We can see the hip joint right here is working, as well as the knee joint and then ankle joint. The hip joint has a moment arm from the hip to the line of force, which is going to be around the halfway point down my leg, so about right here. And at this point is where the knee moment arm is going to extend to. So hip moment arm is going to go from hip to middle, knee is going to go from knee to the middle. And then the ankle right here, the ankle joint is going to have a moment arm that is going to be very low, or it could be zero. This depends on how close the line of force is to being over the ankle. Um, so I'm at a decent point that there should be a little bit of a moment arm present there. As far as external forces go, we have gravity, obviously, which is going to pull my body down and is going to be increased with the weight that I'm carrying. There's going to be ground reaction forces, which are the forces produced through the ground, through my feet. As I'm pushing against the ground is pushing against me, referring to Newton's third law. And then as well as friction forces, which are basically keeping me stable. Internal forces, we're going to again look at the joints. So at the hip joint, there is going to be a vertical upward force working against the downward force that is caused by gravity. And so this upward force is going to occur through the glutes and the hamstrings. The knee joint, we can see, is going through an upward and forward force through the quads. And this stabilizes and extends the knee as we go through that ascent phase. At the ankle joint, we have a forward force through the ankle joint to maintain that forcefully planted feet to keep us stable. And then looking at kinematics, we're going to identify this as which plane of motion this is in. This is in the sagittal plane. And it's also going to have a frontal axis of rotation. The hip joint is going to undergo flexion during the descent and extension during the ascent, as I've previously stated. Knee joint goes through flexion during the descent and then extension during the ascent. Then the ankle joint goes through dorsiflexion during the descent and plantar flexion during the ascent. As far as posture goes, we're seeing here, this is a pretty good spot to stop at. One of the main parts is going to be having the knee over the toes. which I have a pretty good position here, as we can see. One other important detail is having that flat back. There might be a little bit of rounding here, which isn't perfect for me, but we'll take it. Should also be an upward positioned chest, with the chest remaining upright, while the spine is still remaining straight. I have a bit too much of a forward lean here, I think. I would like to see myself a little more upright, but this is still a decent position to be in for that posture. So yeah, we've already gone through the phases, a little bit more with the phases and what's happening. Get out of the laser. So during the descent right there, we have an eccentric contraction that is the main process happening. So the hamstrings are going to be contracting eccentrically, while the quads are going to be the antagonist. The glutes right here are going to be aiding in hip flexion, as well as controlling the descent, while the hip flexors are acting as the antagonist. And then the gastrocnemius and soleus are also going to be performing here. They're contracting as dorsiflexion occurs, and the antagonist here is the tibialis anterior. And then the core throughout all these phases is going to be acting as a stabilizer, helping in maintaining that upright position. And here, with my bit of leaning forward, we could conclude that I may have a little bit of that core weakness, that may be aiding in that compensation for me to be leaning forward. Yeah, this will be contracting isometrically through everything. During the ascent, we're going to see concentric contraction of the quads, as well as in the hamstring. So the quads are going to concentrically contract, and this is going to help extend the knees and get our body lifted up. And the quads are very powerful muscles, so they specialize in that power, and that's what we need to get our bodies up there. The glutes will also be contracting concentrically, and they're the main driver of that hip extension. And then the hip flexors are acting as the antagonist. Gastroc and soleus are also working here, concentrically contracting for that plantar flexion, giving us that stability and keeping our feet and toes on the ground. And then again, the core will be isometrically contracting. So to look a little bit at what could be wrong with this movement, as I stated before, that forward lean is a bit too much. Could be core weakness. I think that would be the main culprit here. It appears I have slight knee valgus. There is also a frontal video that is not included here, but you could see it a little bit better. So had that, and then also had that little bit of limited depth, which could be a problem with my range of motion with my hip flexors. So going into a little bit more of the biomechanical principles, looking at Newton's laws. The first law is the law of inertia, and so basically what we need to be worried about with inertia here is realizing that inertia is referring to our body resisting the movement that we're trying to accomplish. And so there's force through the muscles that are applied to overcome that inertia through this movement. And then Newton's second law, we're looking at acceleration, and we've learned that through the amount of force that we're producing through our muscles, that is going to determine the velocity and speed of our movement, therefore the acceleration. So the amount of force produced by the muscles concentrically, especially during that ascent, is going to determine how big of an acceleration we're going to get through that as well. And then with Newton's third law, I kind of touched on that a little bit. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so we can see that through the ground reaction forces. as the body is performing the action, there's going to be that opposite force that's going to come up through the feet, through the surface of the ground. And then talking about length tension relationship, if the squat is a bit too shallow, for example, the quads will be lengthened too far and won't be able to produce high amounts of force, and that's going to cause cause the force to be reduced and not produce an ideal movement for us. And then looking at force velocity curve, with concentric contractions, there will be a higher production of force if the movement is slower with a slower velocity, and the opposite is true for eccentric contractions with a higher force being produced with a higher velocity. So through that ascent phase, we want to see kind of a slow movement so that I'm producing high amounts of force and gaining that muscle, while the eccentric phase can be a little bit faster of a velocity to produce more force. So touching on how this could apply to just life in general, functional anatomy, we are going to in life be picking up many objects, and so this is a good way to practice leaning down, lifting up things, and being able to produce enough force to get an object up off the ground, and be able to practice that. There's also just being able to stand up from a sitting position. If we're sitting on something low, we need to have enough force to be able to produce the movement to be able to get up and walking again. For a score for this performance, I would give myself an 8. It's still a pretty good squat, but we can see a little bit of lack of depth, and still that increased forward motion is a bit too much. So I think we can take a few points off for that. And then just identifying a little bit of an impairments, as I already have, limited range of motion in the hips as well as a weak core, are going to cause that forward leaning and rounding of the back. And this is going to put extra tension on the back and could lead to possible injuries. Weak gluteus medius is another thing to look out for, as this can cause knee valgus, which can lead to possible injury. Possible ACL injuries are actually commonly seen through this function. So yeah, and now we're going to move on to single leg deadlift. To the single leg deadlift, I have 2 angles for this, so we're going to play both videos. This is the frontal angle. You can already see a little bit of an imbalance there, swaying back and forth a decent bit. And then the lateral view. So go ahead and touch on the kinetics of this movement a little bit. So first, looking at the primary movers of this movement, we have the gluteus maximus and hamstrings, that are the main movers here, and the core is again acting as a stabilizer here. Yeah. There are high levels of torque at the hip as the trunk is tilting to that horizontal position, and there is a minimal torque at the knee joint. So looking at internal forces, we have that posterior vector around the glutes and hamstrings that's going to be pulling upward and back on the femur, and that's going to help extend that hip, as we see around this point. Yeah, and it's going to be an anterior vector at the quads to maintain that knee extension, and then a vertical vector at the ankle to provide that stabilization at the feet, facilitated by muscles like the tibialis anterior and the fibularis longus. And then that'll be the front leg ankle. Yeah. External forces, very similar to what we saw in the goblet squat. We have gravity and ground reaction forces acting against this movement, as well as the external weight kind of incorporated with that gravity, and then friction force keeping that foot stable on the ground. For kinematics, this is another sagittal plane movement. We see through the lowering phase, the hip joint is undergoing flexion and extension while maintaining control of the abduction and adduction. The knee joint through both of these phases is undergoing slight flexion during that initial hinge phase. Then the ankle joint goes through dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, as well as a bit of inversion and eversion for that control and stabilization if need be. You can see that a bit on the first video as I'm trying to maintain my balance as my body is kind of swaying a little bit. For posture, the exercise should begin in the leaned over phase, picking up the weight. The back should be straight and flat at the horizontal position, not leaning too far forward or too far back, and a standing leg should have a slight bend in the knee and pronounced hip flexion around the 70 to 80 degree mark. So for the lowering phase, or the eccentric phase, the gluteus maximus is controlling hip flexion eccentrically, and the hamstrings are being lengthened, trying to offer that stabilization. The adductor magnus is also playing a slight role, aiding in hip extension stability. For the bottom position, we're going to see hamstrings and gluteus maximus eccentrically loaded, ready for that ascent phase to start. The gluteus medius and minimus are also stabilizing to maintain that level pelvis. For the rising phase, the gluteus maximus is going to extend the hip, while the hamstrings are assisting in that hip extension. And again, the adductor magnus is supporting the drive of the hips. So for the diagnosis and human movement portion, there's not enough movement to get to that horizontal position as desired. We can look through this video. It's the best angle. My body never really reaches that horizontal plane that we want. That's about as low as I get, and we can see that this line is good arch there, and there's no flat back. My leg is also not at that horizontal position we want. The ideal position we want is for this to be one flat plane. And so we'll talk about some of my possible inefficiencies and why those are happening a bit later. And again, you can see more in this video. I'm having trouble with the balance there. This could be some issue with my core, and the movements between the phases aren't very smooth either, so I'm lacking a bit of coordination and strength. So as I described before, this is a hinge movement as the hip is being flexed, not quite the squat that we saw before. I'm lowering my body, but we're not getting to that full squat position. We're just seeing a hinge at the hip. So for some biomechanical principles, Newton's first law we can apply again as this action occurs, the body is trying to overcome its own inertia. And this can be seen with the body wobbling due to weak balance as it's trying to stay in motion. So trying to overcome that inertia, I'm having trouble with that force still being applied. And then for the second law, Newton's second law, we can apply this to acceleration. During the lowering phase, gravity is pulling the body down, and the more force that is being held, pulling the body down, the more weight that is needed to lift me up, and that the amount of force needed is going to determine the velocity, and therefore determine the how fast I'm accelerating to that velocity with that amount of mass that I'm holding. For Newton's third law, as the foot is pushing into the ground is pushing back with that ground reaction force. Same thing as the goblet squat. We're just saying that there's an equal and opposite reaction taking place here. Then looking at length tension relationship, the movement can be negatively impacted if the length tension relationship of the muscles is not correct. An example of this could be the glutes being lengthened in this exercise, causing a lack of proper hip extension. Moving on to functional anatomy, the single leg deadlift translates to many areas of life, very similar to the goblet squat, where there are a lot of lifting motions that we need throughout life. So this is a good way to know kind of where we're at, specifically lifting things while we're still in that standing position. If there are obstacles in our life where we need to be holding something else and can't quite just fully bend our legs in a squat position, we may need to bend in this hinge motion. So it's important to build those muscles, practice this movement to make sure we have efficient force production and good balance as well. Balance is a huge part of this. For performance evaluation, I'd give myself a 5 for this movement, mainly just through this angle. You can see just the inefficiency through the back, as well as not getting the leg up. There's many possible dysfunctions that could disrupt the movement. One thing is tight hip flexors, and I currently have an injury that is caused by my weak gluteus medius and maximus, as well as having tight hip flexors and hamstrings. So this is an interesting movement to look at, as you can kind of see how my inefficiencies are being displayed. The tight hip flexors are making it where my leg just really is not wanting to get much above this point, and so creating more of a larger angle is really difficult for me in this position. As well as core stability, having that lack of balance, core stability as well as weak glutes are going to contribute to that lack of balance and make this motion a bit harder for me. Yeah, and like I said, tight hamstrings as well are going to impact this as well. So yeah, I give myself a 5 for that. And those are the two movements that I've chosen. I hope that was very informative. And yeah, thank you for watching.